Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about the global trade organizations, and this will be the final part of our presentation. First, to start off with global developments. The end of the Cold War truly ended the last barriers of full global interaction. Now, countries weren't limited by old alliances. For example, people from Eastern and Western Europe could facilitate trade with the United States or Russia or Asia, and this really symbolized the growing global integration of financial networks and economic connections. In addition, Eastern Asia has also begun to really grow their industry and commercial interdependence, really symbolizing their comeback in economic and political growth.
Okay, so now I'll be talking about the Marshall Plan. And so this was sort of like a foreign policy that was proposed by the United States, and it was really an American aid to Western Europe. Specifically, the United States gave $13 billion for economic support, and that's a lot of money, to help rebuild European economies. Furthermore, European nations began to cooperate with each other after this policy was introduced. In 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community was established, and it incorporated 6 main nations: Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Italy, France, and Luxembourg.
And this European Coal and Steel Company is really seen, and we've seen with industry, as the last slide said, industry has really grown and is essentially peaking in some way, but more growing. And this really symbolizes the economic connection with industry between these 6 nations, with the main resources and products such as coal and steel.
So like Nihal said, industries were growing, and so it's really inevitable that this community, as it does 6 years later in 1957, the European Economic Community initiated common trade policies, and so that was sort of like starting to symbolize the growing European identity and the single currency, which was the euro. In fact, in 1999, the Eurozone ensured that the euro existed among all nations, and the exceptions were only Britain, Sweden, and Denmark. Adding on, as communism diffused globally, the United States created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which defended Europe against the Soviet Union. To combat the NATO, the Soviet Union introduced the Warsaw Pact, which incorporated Eastern Europe, just for general information.
Now let's go more into depth on the European Union. Well, initially, like we said, it was the European Economic Community, but it was transformed into what is now known as the European Union. This essentially tied in the participating countries, as Sean said, besides Sweden, Denmark, and the United Kingdom, to a common currency of the euro. And the formation of this union to adopt that common currency was called the Eurozone. This truly resembled that they wanted to create a single market to combine the economic powers of Europe, because they felt that if they took the strengths of all of the nations together, they would provide more economic benefit and strive rather than individual nations competing against each other. This unity could really contrast the North American unity, solely spreading the benefit. However, there was an economic crisis in the late 2000s where some European nations have collapsed. However, some had prevailed. Now, this difference between the prevailing nations and the essentially economically weaker nations truly symbolize the amount that stronger economies such as Germany had to carry those weaker, I guess more overextended economies that had collapsed. And this really questioned economic integration, because they felt that maybe they could be better off with just the stronger economies together, or maybe it's those weaker economies that are bringing them down, and that maybe they might be better individually. For example, if Germany had not had to carry those weaker economies, maybe they would have succeeded a lot more, and this economic crisis wouldn't have exactly impacted them as much as they can go on independently. Now, this brought up fears of political and judicial integration as well, because although it was primarily economic, there were other political ideals that were inside the European Union and that were spurring around. Now, In the 1990s, the emergence of the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA, promoted the growth of global integration between cultures, and this resembled the growing transportation and interaction because this facilitated trade amongst Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and it connected the economies together. This was possible due to the prohibiting of tariffs and trade barriers, as trade could be essentially pure and free, and it spread out the economic benefit. And it also led into interdependency, as Mexico truly began to rise because of its connection with such powers such as the US and Canada. And it was kind of like they brought them all up together, as friends, I guess, but economic friends. Now, in addition, internet and English really facilitated communication across the world, and US became a very big center of globalization and popular culture. And I guess they go hand to hand because as the US began to spread, English also began to spread because more countries wanted to be connected with these three global countries that were connected through this NAFTA agreement. And through that, internet spread, English spread, and that's just limiting some of the popular culture.
Just adding on, so basically as communism was declining and as well as the Soviet Union, the European Union was actually strengthening at that time. And in fact, in 2011, 10 out of the 27 nations became a part of the European Union that were once Soviet nations.
In addition, the World Trade Organization had been established to use more economic incentives to tie nations together, as they would somewhat, not regulate, but look over the rules for trading between nations. In specific, the primary motive behind the World Trade Organization was to tie the producers, exporters, and importers together to set up these global corporations that ultimately led to economic globalization because they would tie these nations together. And although the World Trade Organization heavily advocated for free trade in the hope to improve the living standards for individuals, ensure balanced utilization of resources, and aiming to protect the environment, many detested the glowing global equalities, which led to protesters from all over the world. For example, specifically in Seattle, there were many violent protests because the people felt that they were being overshadowed by these global corporations, and their say and impact in society was lessening. The World Trade Organization also enabled nations to implement future schemes related to trade and tariff restrictions, and facilitated communication and operations between nations to settle disputes, which reinforced cultural and global interaction between countries. In addition, after World War II, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund had been established, and these were focusing on the negatives of what happened during the Great Depression and the World War II and all of these wars put together. And they had three main goals. One was to regulate the global economy. They wanted it to be stable. They didn't want it to decline and bring down many countries as seen in the Great Depression. And this ties into the next one. They wanted to prevent another global depression. They realized the strain it had put on nations together as corporations had fallen and many important ties to countries had also diminished. Now, this also ties into the third one. To prevent another global depression, they had to stimulate economic growth. They had to stimulate global interactions and global corporations in hopes to bring the world up together, as they didn't want to favor one or two nations. And in specific, the World Bank primarily was created to fund reconstruction efforts after World War II. For example, many cities and, in fact, nations in Europe were devastated by the war, and they were forced to spend most of their funds and financing on rebuilding the regular infrastructure of their nation, and that is a great deal of stress on the nation's resources. Therefore, the World Bank wanted to finance those nations and help fund them so that they would not suffer too much and they wouldn't fall way too behind and somewhat inhibit that global economic growth. In addition, the International Monetary Fund was more focused on, in general, global financing to make sure that the global economy was stable and that everyone was on an equal playing ground as they all rise together, even though there were going to be some that were more superior than others. In addition to do that, they realized that they had to focus on three main goals: to promote high unemployment. Now, this would not only increase the globalization and economy of the countries, but also, leading into the second point, reduce poverty, as people have higher standards of living. In addition, they wanted to support countries in financial crises, similar to the World Bank, but more in general, as they realized that those financial crises can inhibit a country from stimulating economic growth. Thank you for watching, and that should conclude our video. I hope you enjoyed, and if you'd like to go back and touch any key points, please refer to either our works cited or rewatch the videos. Thank you. See you next time.